My name is Celena Tremaine, and I am 35 years old. 6 weeks ago, a semi-truck ran a red light on Highway Y84, leaving me comatose with a shattered collarbone. My 10-month-old daughter was home with a temporary babysitter whose shift was ending. My mother lived 20 minutes away. When the police called her, she refused to drive over because she and my sister Evelyn were leaving for the airport to catch a Caribbean cruise. She texted me to use my car insurance money for babysitter overtime and to stop being selfish. That second, the warmth inside me died. Now, staring at a 3-inch thick forensic audit folder on my hospital bed, I am dismantling their world. They thought they were boarding a luxury liner for a family vacation, completely unaware they were actually sailing straight into total financial ruin. Before I tell you the rest of this story, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story truly resonates with your heart. I really want to know, where are you watching from right now? And what local time is it over there? Drop a comment below, because I read every single one of them, and seeing where you are makes this community feel like home. Let me take you back to the beginning of the paperwork that started it all. I grew up in New Britain, just outside of Hartford, Connecticut. It's a quiet town, the kind of place where people work hard, fix their own porches, and don't like to make scenes. My father, Robert, was a quiet man who spent 30 years fixing machinery at a local manufacturing plant. But 9 years ago, his heart started failing. That was the year my mother, Sandra, called a family meeting at their kitchen table. She sat there with her pearls on, looking tragic, and told me that Dad's specialized treatments were going to bankrupt them. She said it cost exactly $700 every single month, and insurance wouldn't cover a dime of it. My sister Evelyn was 28 at the time, living at home, and according to my mother, she was too artistic to handle financial stress. So the invoice was handed to me, and for 9 long years I paid it without asking a single question, because I loved my dad. In my line of work, you don't look at feelings. You look at the architecture of numbers. As a senior supply chain manager for a major logistics corporation in Hartford, my entire life was defined by efficiency, optimization, and identifying systemic leaks. I managed multi-million-dollar shipping grids across the eastern seaboard, ensuring that every crate, every invoice, and every dollar landed precisely where it was designated to go. If a vendor tried to slip an unauthorized $50 fuel surcharge into a 40-page shipping manifestation, my eyes would lock onto it within 3 seconds. Numbers don't lie. People do. Yet when it came to my own mother and the $4,700 monthly bill she presented to me at that kitchen table, my professional skepticism completely evaporated. For nearly a decade, I treated that staggering sum as a non-negotiable operational cost of keeping my father alive. Every single month, like clockwork, I wired the funds directly from my checking account to a designated medical bank account my mother had set up, supposedly linked to the cardiology wing of the Yale New Haven Health Network. To afford this without drowning in debt myself, I made severe lifestyle cuts that would sound absurd to most corporate professionals my age. I lived in a cramped, drafty studio apartment in New Britain with a radiator that clanked all night, drove a dented sedan with 180,000 miles on the odometer, and skipped every single vacation or major purchase for 9 straight years. I shrank my life. I became invisible. Meanwhile, my mother and Evelyn lived a remarkably different reality under the radar. Every time I looked at social media, I would see photos of them dining at expensive seafood houses in Newport or spending weekends at luxury boutiques in Boston, always wrapped in fine wool and carrying designer shopping bags. When I occasionally asked my mother how she could afford those trips while Dad was supposedly clinging to life, she would sigh dramatically, adjust her pearls, and tell me that Evelyn's artistic consultations were finally paying off. They never invited me to those dinners, and in every family photo uploaded to Facebook, I was completely absent, cropped out like an embarrassing footnote to their polished, elegant lifestyle. I tolerated the isolation and the grueling budget because my spreadsheet showed that my father was stable, and that was the only metric that mattered to my heart. I thought my silent sacrifices were keeping our fragile family unit from collapsing into financial ruin. But as I would soon discover through a devastating piece of highway asphalt, the metrics I trusted were built entirely on a foundation of calculated lies. The cold truth didn't emerge at that kitchen table. It waited for me on a dark, rainy Tuesday when the concrete of Highway Y84 shattered my illusion of family forever. The rain that evening didn't just blur the windshield, it turned the asphalt into a sheet of black glass. I was driving home from a grueling 12-hour shift at the logistics hub, my mind running through shipping manifests and delivery schedules, completely exhausted. I remember the exact intersection near exit 44, the rhythmic hum of my wipers, and the sudden blinding flash of high beams tearing through the downpour from my left. A massive commercial semi-truck, barreling down the slippery off-ramp, completely ignored the red light and slammed directly into my driver's side door with the force of a falling building. The sound of twisting metal and shattering safety glass was the last thing my brain registered before the world flipped upside down and everything went completely black. Metal crushed steel. Silence followed. When I finally opened my eyes 6 weeks later, the sharp, suffocating scent of rubbing alcohol and bleached hospital linens had replaced the damp air of my old sedan. My vision cleared slowly, focusing on the rhythmic, maddening beep of a heart monitor and the heavy cast binding my shattered collarbone and fractured ribs. A nurse stepped into the dim room, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and profound relief when she saw that my eyes were finally open. "You're incredibly lucky to be alive, Celena," she whispered gently, checking my vitals with trembling hands before delivering the news that made my stomach drop harder than the crash itself. She told me that the Hartford police had frantically tried to track down my emergency contact list because my 10-month-old daughter had been left at home with a temporary college babysitter. The babysitter's shift had ended hours after my accident, and she was terrified, trapped in my house with a crying infant and a phone that kept ringing out. My mother's house was located exactly 20 minutes away from my front door. She was the only person in the state with a spare key, the only person who could have driven over to open the door and protect my helpless daughter from being handed over to social services that night. With shaky fingers, I reached for my phone on the bedside table, my heart hammering against my fractured ribs as I unlocked the screen to find a single text message from her. It wasn't a question about whether I was surviving, nor was it an apology for leaving my child stranded in an empty house. It was a vibrant, sun-drenched photograph of my mother and Evelyn standing on the pristine white deck of a luxury cruise liner, holding tropical cocktails with small pink umbrellas. Beneath the photo, my mother had typed a message that read, "Evelyn is on the verge of a serious nervous breakdown over her new business expansion, and this family desperately needed this cruise to stay unified. We were already at the airport checking our bags when the police called, and these tickets are completely non-refundable, so there was absolutely nothing we could do anyway. You're already at the hospital surrounded by world-class doctors, so stop being so incredibly dramatic and just use your car insurance payout to pay the babysitter overtime. Don't ruin this family vacation with your usual selfishness, Celena." I stared at the glowing screen for 3 full minutes, the text message reflecting in the dark glass of the quiet hospital room as the cold rain tapped softly against the window pane. I didn't scream. I didn't shed a single tear. The frantic, desperate daughter who had spent 9 years begging for their love through compliance died right there on that cheap mattress. In her place woke a senior supply chain manager who realized that a massive, systemic fraud had been operating within her life, and it was time to close the account forever. The hospital bed became my command center, and the digital paper trail I was about to unearth would turn their tropical paradise into a legal nightmare before they even touched land. My laptop was resting on my hospital food tray. My fingers were bruised, but they were steady on the keyboard. As a supply chain manager, I had administrative access to the shared digital folder where I required my mother to upload every single invoice from the cardiology network before I authorized the monthly $4,700 transfers. For 9 years, I had looked at those scanned medical documents on my small phone screen late at night. too exhausted from work and too blinded by guilt to notice the systemic anomalies buried within the formatting. Now, with the clinical clarity of a woman who had almost died alone, I began downloading the entire 9-year archive into an independent spreadsheet. I isolated the metadata. I ran a forensic tracking code. Within 2 hours of digging through the electronic files, the numbers began to talk, and the story they told made my blood run colder than the winter rain outside my window. Every single invoice from the past 48 months carried the exact same routing number, but it didn't belong to the billing department of Yale New Haven Health. It belonged to a private business checking account registered under a commercial entity called Boston Curls LLC. The sole owner of that corporation was my sister, Evelyn Tremaine. My mother hadn't been paying for my father's pacemaker replacements or specialized cardiac therapy. She had been rerouting my life savings directly into a commercial expansion fund for Evelyn's ambitious business ventures. Nearly $500,000 of my hard-earned money had been systematically laundered through fake medical bills to buy a high-end luxury salon franchise in downtown Boston. I sat back against the thin hospital pillows, the blue light of the monitor illuminating the stark reality of my complete erasure. They had built a life on my sweat. They had left me in a clanking apartment while they funded an empire. But the logic that made me an expert at corporate asset tracking was now fully locked onto their fraudulent operations, and I had no intention of stopping until every single dollar was accounted for. I didn't call my mother to yell, because anger is a volatile emotion that ruins a perfectly good paper trail. Instead, I opened an encrypted email window and attached the entire forensic spreadsheet, routing logs and fraudulent invoices directly to the regional office of the Internal Revenue Service and my corporate attorney. Evelyn wanted an empire. I was about to give her an audit. The cruise ship was currently floating somewhere off the coast of Florida, completely cut off from the legal storm that was about to hit their accounts the second they docked at the next port. But before I initiated the final sequence of my restructuring plan, I needed to verify one last devastating variable regarding my father's actual medical condition. The digital trail had exposed Evelyn's fraudulent salon empire, but the final, most devastating piece of the puzzle was waiting in my father's official medical records. I needed verification. I called Dr. Mercer's office at the Yale New Haven Health Network directly from my hospital room, utilizing my corporate authority to bypass the standard bureaucratic delays. When his administrative assistant pulled up my father's file, her voice carried a tone of quiet confusion that confirmed my worst fears. She informed me that my father's advanced cardiology treatments and pacemaker replacements had been covered 100% by his federal Veterans Affairs benefits since day one. He didn't owe a single dime. The hospital had never issued a single monthly invoice for $4,700. My mother had completely fabricated the medical crisis, leveraging my love for my father to systematically extract nearly $500,000 from my paycheck over 9 grueling years. My hands gripped the hospital bedsheet so hard my knuckles turned white under the harsh fluorescent lights. Right at that exact second, my phone began to buzz in my hand, the caller ID flashing the name I used to look at with a desperate need for approval. "Mom," I answered, pressing the phone to my ear without saying a word, listening to the muffled sound of steel drum music and laughter in the background of her cruise ship. "Celena, darling." Sandra's voice drifted through the static, sounding artificially sweet and utterly hollow. Evelyn and I were just looking at the shore excursion menu for Jamaica, and her corporate credit card is temporarily declined for some silly technical reason. I need you to wire another $30,500 to the medical account immediately so we don't experience any disruptions on this trip, and please, don't start crying about your budget again. I lay there in that dark hospital room, listening to the woman who had left my infant daughter alone in an empty house so she could drink cocktails on a cruise liner financed by my stolen youth. I didn't yell. I didn't lose my temper. "The wire transfers are permanently terminated, Sandra," I said, my voice completely flat, cold, and carrying the absolute weight of a final boardroom decision. The line went completely dead for 5 seconds before my mother began to screech, her voice escalating into a theatrical display of wounded motherhood. but I simply hung up the phone and turned it face down on the table. Hey, I want to pause this story right here because my heart is hammering just reliving this exact moment in that hospital room. If you were standing in my shoes right now, looking at the evidence of a 9-year betrayal, what would you have done next? Would you have kept this inside the family to protect your father's fragile peace? Or would you have handed that paper trail directly to the federal authorities like I was about to do? I really want to know your raw perspective on setting boundaries with toxic bloodlines. Type family if you think blood deserves mercy, or type justice if you believe fraud has no rangioi. And if you are rooting for the truth to come out, please hit that like button right now to help more people find this channel. Now, let me tell you about the corporate trap I set while they were still out at sea. Instead of engaging in an emotional screaming match, I emailed the entire certified forensic audit spreadsheet, the routing numbers, and the falsified hospital letterheads directly to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. My corporate attorney formally flagged Evelyn's business checking accounts for suspected grand larceny and tax evasion lien bang. The cruise ship was currently floating in international waters, completely isolated from the financial avalanche that was quietly freezing their entire financial existence. They thought they were on a luxury vacation, but my spreadsheet was about to ensure their red carpet arrival in Boston turned into a public execution. 3 weeks later, the tropical tans had faded, but their arrogant illusions of grandeur were at an all-time high. Evelyn was hosting the grand opening gala for her premier luxury salon franchise, located in a beautifully restored historic brownstone in the heart of Boston's upscale Back Bay district. This was the grand stage my mother and sister had spent nearly a decade building with my stolen sweat. The evening was a showcase of pure old money vanity, designed specifically to impress local investors, wealthy socialites, and several high-profile boutique owners from the New England area. Valet drivers in crisp uniforms uniform-lined Commonwealth Avenue, parking luxury German sedans, while a cellist quartet played classical melodies near the arched entrance. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocatingly opulent, filled with the scent of expensive white orchids, French champagne, and the clinking of crystal glasses under the custom brass chandeliers. My mother, Sandra, was circulating through the crowded ballroom in a lavender designer gown that cost more than my annual apartment rent, her signature pearls gleaming under the spotlight. She was glowing. She was radiating triumph. She held a champagne flute high, loudly telling a group of wealthy tennis partners how her eldest daughter, Evelyn, was a visionary entrepreneur who had built this entire business empire from scratch through sheer dedication. Evelyn stood beside her on the small raised stage, wearing a tailored emerald velvet suit, soaking in the applause of 50 high-profile Bostonians who believed she was a corporate prodigy. Neither of them had checked their personal business bank accounts since getting off the cruise ship that morning, assuming the minor credit card decline in Jamaica was just a temporary glitch. They truly believed they had successfully papered over my existence, leaving the dramatic, broken younger daughter behind in the sterile Hartford hospital bed to pay off the babysitter. They had cast the audience. They had written the script. But as the clock on the mahogany wall ticked closer to 8 in the evening, the grand opening gala was about to experience a massive disruption in its carefully optimized schedule. The heavy oak entrance doors swung open, cutting through the laughter. The cellist quartet stopped mid-note. The crowd parted slowly, a collective wave of silent confusion sweeping across the glittering room as a woman in a basic charcoal corporate suit slowly rolled into the center of the thème d'eau on a medical wheelchair. My face was still pale from 6 weeks of hospital confinement, and the dark blue shadow of a fading concussion was visible near my jaw, but my spine was completely rigid. I wasn't looking for an apology. I was delivering an invoice. Behind my wheelchair stood 2 broad-shouldered men in tailored dark suits, carrying leather briefcases that bore the official, unyielding seal of the Internal Revenue Service. The red carpet they were standing on was beautiful, but it was about to become the exact location where 9 years of systemic family exploitation met the cold, unmovable wall of federal asset forfeiture. The silence that rolled through the Back Bay brownstone was immediate and heavy. Conversations died mid-sentence. Glasses paused halfway to lips. My mother's radiant smile didn't just fade, it shattered completely as her gaze locked onto my wheelchair and the federal badges gleaming under her expensive chandeliers. She staggered back a step, her fingers tightening around her champagne flute until the crystal clinked against her diamond rings. "Celena?" Her voice was a harsh, strangled whisper that barely carried across the sudden stillness of the room. "What is the meaning of this ridiculous stunt? You are supposed to be resting in Hartford, not bringing this shameful drama to your sister's milestone evening." I didn't answer her with anger, because numbers had already spoken for me. I gestured to my corporate attorney, who stepped forward and pulled a stack of certified federal documents from his leather portfolio, handing them directly to Evelyn. Evelyn's face drained of color as she read the bold black lettering at the top of the page. "Notice of federal tax lien and emergency asset seizure." "This cannot be right," Evelyn gasped, her voice losing its polished entrepreneurial confidence as she looked at the investors who were already taking a cautious step back from her. "This salon is a legitimate corporation. There is a massive mistake here." The senior IRS agent stepped forward, his voice carrying the calm, crushing authority of the United States government. "There is no mistake, Ms. Tremaine," he said, adjusting his glasses as he looked at her tailored emerald suit. "We have verified a 9-year trail of commingled funds and systematic bank fraud operating under the entity of Boston Curls LLC. Nearly $500,000 of unreported laundered income has been moved through a fraudulent medical account to fund this property and evade federal estate taxes." My mother's face went white. She looked at Evelyn, then at the agents, her mind scanning through her mental files of emotional guilt trips and finding absolutely nothing that could withstand a federal warrant. "Celena, please," my mother hissed, stepping toward my wheelchair, her Chanel perfume suddenly suffocating. "We are a family. We can sort this out privately without destroying everything your sister has worked for." "Evelyn didn't work for this, Sandra," I said, my voice level, steady, and loud enough for every single investor in the room to hear. "I worked for it. For 9 years, I lived in a freezing studio apartment while you told me my father was dying of a condition that was already paid for by his federal benefits." A collective gasp rippled through the upscale crowd as the mask of family unity was ripped away in real time. Evelyn was trembling. The empire was crumbling. But as my mother prepared to launch into a theatrical display of wounded motherhood to salvage her social standing, the heavy oak doors of the salon opened one final time, revealing the true architect of their undoing. The crowd parted instantly. An elderly man stepped into the warm glow of the chandeliers, his unyielding presence cutting through the suffocating tension of the room like a cold wind. It was my grandfather, Arthur Tremaine. At 82 years old, he didn't lean on his silver-topped cane for support. He held it like a weapon of law and order. He was dressed in a pristine, tailored charcoal suit that commanded immediate respect, a stark contrast to the performative luxury surrounding my sister. Behind him stood 2 uniformed Boston police officers, their faces completely serious, ensuring that nobody in that room moved an inch. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her throat as her pearls suddenly felt like a noose. "Arthur?" Sandra whispered, her voice cracking as she staggered back against the polished display counters. "What are you doing here? You are supposed to be at your estate in Newport. You shouldn't be traveling in your condition." Grandfather Arthur stopped at the edge of the Thames d'Eau, his sharp blue eyes looking through his daughter-in-law with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "My condition is perfectly fine, Sandra." His voice boomed across the silent ballroom, carrying the weight of a man who had built our family's original manufacturing legacy from the ground up. "The only thing suffering from a terminal condition in this room is your complete lack of morality." Evelyn tried to step forward, her hands shaking within her emerald velvet sleeves as she attempted to project an illusion of innocence. "Grandpa, please listen to me," she started, her voice trembling. "This is a massive legal misunderstanding. Celena is simply hysterical because of her car accident, and she is trying to ruin my hard work." Grandfather Arthur slammed the base of his cane against the hardwood floor, a loud, sharp crack that silenced her instantly. "Shut up, Evelyn," he said, his tone dropping into a freezing register that left no room for negotiation. "I didn't drive 3 hours from Newport because of a misunderstanding. I drove here because I am the sole owner of the Tremaine Family Commercial Trust. And as the commercial landlord of this exact historic brownstone, I have already signed the legal eviction paperwork to terminate your commercial lease for structural fraud, effective immediately." He pulled a certified document from his jacket pocket and threw it flat onto the temdo between them. "You thought I was an old detached man sitting alone in Newport, completely unaware of how you were treating my granddaughter, Celena. You told me Robert's medical bills were being handled by an independent foundation, while you were actually using my son's health to bleed Celena dry for 9 long years. My father, Robert, had been shielded from their greed, but grandfather Arthur had been quietly watching the spreadsheets from afar. I am Tuakbotoan Bo, right of inheritance from you, Sandra, and your corporate entity is officially blacklisted from every property I own. You didn't build an empire, Evelyn. You built a crime scene on your sister's back, and I am tearing it down tonight." The investors fled. The room emptied. Sandra and Evelyn stood frozen in the center of their ruined stage, completely stripped of their social capital and facing a federal avalanche they could never escape. I rolled my wheelchair back toward the exit, my grandfather walking steady by my side, leaving them to face the police officers who were already moving in with their handcuffs. The Back Bay Gala was officially over, but the actual restructuring of our fractured lives was just moving into its final permanent phase. The fallout was swift, calculated, and perfectly documented. Federal prosecutors in Boston don't negotiate with systemic fraud. Within 2 months of that red carpet confrontation, Evelyn's commercial bank accounts were permanently liquidated by the government to satisfy the unpaid federal estate taxes and restitution claims. The historic Back Bay brownstone was stripped of its white orchids and crystal chandeliers, its windows covered in dark plywood boards bearing official federal seizure notices. Evelyn was formally indicted on multiple counts of grand larceny, wire fraud, and tax evasion. Her dream of an elite salon empire collapsed completely, replaced by a 5-year federal prison sentence and a mandatory restitution order that would hollow out her financial existence for the rest of her life. She lost everything. My mother, Sandra, didn't escape the wreckage either, though she managed to avoid direct prison time by throwing Evelyn under the bus during her depositions. Her standing in the upscale Hartford and Newport social circles was completely obliterated. The country club quietly revoked her membership, citing conduct unbecoming of a member, while her parish council friends stopped answering her frantic phone calls. She became a pariah. She was a woman trapped in an empty house, staring at the walls, completely isolated by the natural consequences of her own cruel calculations. During her desperate spiral, she attempted to call me exactly 47 times from various unblocked numbers, leaving breathless, weeping voicemails on my phone. She claimed she was an old, overwhelmed mother who had simply made a minor mistake under financial stress, begging me to use my logistics salary to help pay off Evelyn's remaining legal fees. I didn't argue with her. I didn't scream back. I systematically blocked every single line, downloaded the voice transcripts into my digital evidence file, and formally instructed my corporate attorney to send her a final binding cease and desist letter. Setting boundaries isn't an act of revenge. It is a basic matter of survival. The most critical asset reallocation, however, involved my father. With the help of grandfather Arthur, I legally assumed full healthcare proxy and financial guardianship over Robert Tremaine, permanently stripping Sandra of any authority over his existence. I moved him out of that toxic household and settled him into a beautiful, quiet, single-story home in the suburbs of Farmington, Connecticut, surrounded by green lawns and mature oak trees. He was finally safe. One quiet evening while I was setting the table for dinner, my father looked up at me with eyes that were watery but completely clear. He reached across the table, his rough hands trembling slightly as he took my fingers in his grip, a silent acknowledgement of the 9 years of quiet burdens I had carried for him. I was blind, Celena, he whispered, a single tear cutting through the deep lines of his face. I knew Sandra was greedy. I knew Evelyn was entitled, but I stood by and allowed them to turn you into a sacrifice because it was easier than facing the conflict. I am so incredibly sorry for my weakness. I squeezed his hand tightly, feeling the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart under his sleeve. I hear you, Dad, I said softly, my voice firm but entirely devoid of the old, aching resentment. But sorry doesn't rewrite the past. It just gives us a clean slate to build something honest from the ground up. We ate our dinner in a comfortable, healing silence, the blue light of the evening sky fading gently outside the dining room window. The metrics of my life were finally balancing out. But as the first year of our freedom drew to a close, it was time to lock in the final coordinates of our legacy. Today, 1 year exactly since that rainy evening on Highway I-84, I sat at the head of a beautifully crafted oak table in our new home. The Farmington air outside was crisp, carrying the clean, sharp scent of autumn pine and wet leaves. Inside, my kitchen was absolute chaos. It was the best kind of chaos. My daughter, now a bright and healthy 14-month-old, was sitting on Grandfather Arthur's lap, her tiny fingers covered in vanilla buttercream frosting. My father, Robert, was sitting right beside them, laughing genuinely as he poured fresh coffee into clean ceramic mugs. There were no toxic calculations here. There were no hidden invoices. This table was built on a foundation of absolute truth, unconditional support, and mutual respect. I looked around at these people, the family that had actively chosen to show up when my world collapsed, and felt a profound sense of completeness. I had survived the wreckage, optimized my life, and built an empire of genuine peace. Setting clear boundaries with the people who share your DNA isn't an act of cruelty or dramatic revenge. It is a cold, mathematical necessity for your own survival. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of my journey. If my story touched your heart, or if it reminded you of your own worth, please take a brief moment to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell right now. Your incredible support is what allows this channel to bring more stories of quiet dignity and absolute justice to light. I want to keep this vital conversation going in the comments below. Have you ever had to permanently walk away from toxic relatives to protect your own children and your mental health? Drop your raw experiences below because I read every single one of them, and your courage might inspire someone else who is currently struggling alone in the dark. If you want more deep stories about standing up for yourself against family betrayal, check out the links I've pinned in the description right now. Until next time, remember, never let anyone who views you as a transaction dictate your worth, and always save a permanent seat at your table for the people who truly deserve to be there. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you in our next video.